Detroit, a city of cold air, empty factories, and a skyline built on the skeletons of heavy industry. To the world, this is the birthplace of a cultural revolution, the ground zero for 8 Mile. In 2002, the film was hailed as a masterpiece of grit and survival. It transformed Eminem into a global icon and sold the world a seductive narrative that no matter how deep you are in the gutter, one shot is all you need to escape. But 20 years later, a darker pattern has emerged from the shadows of that production. If you look at the evidence, 8 Mile wasn't just a movie about winning. It was a high-stakes psychological experiment that left its subjects vulnerable to a world that didn't know what to do with them once the cameras stopped rolling. 3 lives, 3 rising stars, 3 tragedies. For years, the public has romanticized these deaths as a curse or destiny. But the city didn't kill them, and the movie didn't either. What killed them was the vacuum that followed the applause, the industry abandonment, the lack of mental health support, and a predatory system that extracts brilliance from the broken and discards the remains once the profit margins are met. Tonight, we open the case files on 3 souls who were consumed by the very heat they helped create. First, we examine Angelo Wilson. He was the quiet strength of the crew, the boy from Dayton who achieved the impossible only to find that Hollywood has a very short memory for young, black talent that doesn't fit a convenient mold. His story isn't about a faded star. It's about the lethal silence of an industry that forgets you exist the moment the momentum shifts. Next, we look at Brittany Murphy. To the tabloids, she was a fragile angel who burned too bright. To an investigator, she was a victim of a toxic fame cycle and a domestic isolation that thrived under the indifferent eyes of the industry. Her death wasn't a mystery. It was a failure of intervention. And finally, we confront the loss of proof. The man who provided the heartbeat for the entire Detroit scene. He was gunned down on the very road that gave the film its name, not by an abstract street life, but by a cycle of violence that the world profits from as entertainment, but refuses to address as a crisis. This isn't just a nostalgic look back at a hip-hop classic. This is a post-mortem on the American dream. We are here to ask the uncomfortable questions. Who profits when an artist is used up? Why does the system prioritize the legend over the life? The mirror of 8 Mile didn't just reflect the struggle, it magnified the cracks. And for Angelo, Brittany, and Proof, those cracks became craters that no one reached out to fill. The lights are dimming, and the beat is about to drop. But we aren't here for the lyrics. We're here for the truth behind the tracks. Grab your breath. We're going back to the streets of Detroit to find out why some people get the shot, but no one survives the fallout. This is the investigative reality of 8 Mile. The case of Angelo Wilson is perhaps the most haunting indictment of the Hollywood disposable talent model. He didn't die under the bright lights of a red carpet. He died in the back room of a commercial building in Los Angeles, hidden away from the world that had once cheered for him. To understand why, we have to look past his filmography and into the structural void that swallows young actors once the initial hype evaporates. Angelo wasn't supposed to make it. Born into a fractured system in Dayton, Ohio, he moved through 9 different foster homes, a childhood defined by instability and the constant fear of being unwanted. But he possessed a rare, quiet charisma. He used acting not just as a career, but as a survival mechanism. After getting his GED and studying at Kent State, he wrote a one-man show called Imprecious. It was a raw, unfiltered look at his own loneliness. In 2002, that raw honesty landed him the role of DJ Is in 8 Mile. To an investigator, D'Angelo's performance as DJ Is a study in loyalty. He was the grounded soul of Eminem's crew, the one who looked like he belonged to the streets because he actually did. That same year, he starred in Antwone Fisher alongside Denzel Washington. Within 12 months, a kid from the Dayton foster care system had 2 major motion pictures under his belt. He was the success story the industry loves to promote. But then, the machine moved on. This is the point where the system failed. For a young black actor like D'Angelo, the transition from breakout star to working actor is often a cliff, not a bridge. The roles offered to him after 2002 were Crumb's minor spots in The Shield or CSI. New York. Hollywood had used his authentic street energy for its prestige projects, but it had no plan for his growth. In an industry that demands constant momentum, D'Angelo found himself in a post-success vacuum. The investigative reality of his final years is a grim timeline of isolation. Reports from those close to him describe a man who was beating himself up over a career that was stalling through no fault of his own. He wasn't difficult to work with. He was simply no longer the flavor of the week. On the 26th of November, 2008, the eve of Thanksgiving, the silence of the industry finally became terminal. D'Angelo Wilson took his own life at the age of 29. But the real evidence of the systemic crime lies in what happened after his heart stopped beating. D'Angelo's body lay in that building for an entire week before anyone realized he was gone. One of the rising stars of a multi-million-dollar film had become so invisible that his disappearance didn't even register on the industry's radar. When the police finally contacted his mother, she revealed a final, heartbreaking truth. She couldn't afford to bring him home. The star of 8 Mile was so financially depleted and socially abandoned that he was nearly buried as a John Doe. It took a group of his fellow actors, including the real Antwone Fisher, to pass the hat and raise the funds to send his body back to Dayton. Hollywood didn't kill D'Angelo with a weapon. It killed him with a lack of infrastructure. It took his trauma, turned it into authentic performances for profit, and then offered zero mental health support or career guidance when the phone stopped ringing. He was a victim of a system that views talent as a raw material to be extracted, refined, and discarded. D'Angelo Wilson's death was the first crack in the 8 Mile mirror. It was a warning that the one shot the movie promised could sometimes be a self-inflicted one when the world refuses to give you a second. And as the industry buried the memory of DJ Is, another light from the set was beginning to flicker under the weight of a much more public, yet equally isolating, kind of pressure. Next, we examine the file of Brittany Murphy. If D'Angelo Wilson was killed by Hollywood's silence, Brittany Murphy was devoured by its noise. To the public, she was the radiant energy of 8 Mile, the girl whose Alex gave Eminem's B-Rabbit a reason to believe. But from an investigative standpoint, Brittany's file is a textbook study in how the fame machine creates a vacuum around its stars, making them vulnerable to predators and self-destruction. Brittany was a prodigy of charm. By 13, she had moved to Los Angeles. By 18, she was a cult icon in Clueless. But by the time she stepped onto the set of 8 Mile, something had shifted. The industry had started to demand a different version of Brittany. They wanted her thinner. They wanted her edgier. They wanted her to fit a mold that her natural, bubbly spirit was never meant to occupy. This is where the toxic cycle began. Between 2002 and 2007, the tabloids became obsessed with Brittany's physical transformation. Every pound lost was a headline. Every shaky interview was proof of a drug habit she denied until her last breath. In Hollywood, once the media labels you fragile or unstable, the system begins to distance itself. You become a liability instead of an asset. And it was in this state of professional isolation that Brittany met the man many believe was her ultimate undoing, Simon Monjack. The investigative reality of Brittany's final 2 years is a haunting portrait of domestic and professional quarantine. Monjack, a screenwriter with a trail of lawsuits and debt, became her husband, her manager, and her gatekeeper. Insiders from her final film sets describe a woman who was increasingly cut off from her friends, her mother, and her peers. The glow that had defined her career was replaced by a pale, hollowed-out exhaustion. But why did the industry let it happen? In the high-stakes world of 2009, Hollywood, as long as an actor showed up, no one asked questions. When Brittany was fired from the film The Caller just weeks before her death, the industry didn't see a cry for help. They saw a difficult actress. They closed their doors and waited for the next big thing. On the 20th of December 2009, the vacuum finally collapsed. Brittany Murphy died in her Hollywood Hills home, a mansion, ironically, that she had bought from Britney Spears, another star struggling under the weight of fame. She was 32 years old. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, anemia, and multiple drug intoxication. But the drugs weren't illegal narcotics. They were prescription medications for the very illnesses she was trying to hide so she could keep working. Brittany Murphy died because she was too afraid of the industry's judgment to go to a hospital. She stayed in that house, coughing and weak, trying to self-medicate because, in Hollywood, a sick actress is an unemployed actress. The tragedy took a surreal turn when Simon Monjack died in the same house, of the same causes, just 5 months later. The theories of mold, poison, and foul play flooded the internet, but the investigative truth is much simpler and more devastating. It was a failure of the support system. Brittany was surrounded by people, yet she was utterly alone. She was a multi-million-dollar talent who slipped through the cracks because the people around her and the industry that profited from her prioritized her image over her pulse. Brittany Murphy's Alexandria in 8 Mile was the symbol of hope, but the reality was a girl who looked for love in a toxic place and found a system that would rather watch her fade than offer a hand. As Hollywood dimmed its lights for Brittany, the 8 Mile mirror was about to shatter one last time. This time, the violence wouldn't be internal. It would happen on the very streets that the movie claimed to celebrate. Next, we open the file on the heartbeat of Detroit, proof. If Detroit had a single, beating heart during the rise of the millennium, it belonged to Deshaun Holton, known to the world as Proof. In the investigative history of 8 Mile, Proof is far more than a supporting character. He was the primary architect of the reality that the film attempted to capture. He was the man who validated Eminem when the streets refused to, the visionary who built the hip-hop shop, and the leader who turned Detroit from a graveyard of heavy industry into a global mecca of rhyme. But in the cold, clinical world of true crime, Proof's story serves as a devastating study in what we call the fatal gravity of authenticity. The film 8 Mile was built on the seductive promise of escape. It told the story of Jimmy B. Rabbit Smith using his talent as a vehicle to drive out of the trailer park and into the stratosphere of fame. But Proof lived by a different, much more dangerous code, the code of the stay. He was the architect of the pact, made by the group D12A Blood Oath, that the first one of them to make it big would come back to lift the rest. When Eminem became the most famous artist on the planet, Proof was the bridge. He was the hype man, the protector, and the spiritual anchor who ensured the genius remained tethered to the concrete of Detroit. This is where we find the systemic crime. The music industry has an insatiable hunger for street credibility. Labels and marketing departments love to package the danger, sell the authenticity, and profit from the raw violence of cities like Detroit. But they offer no exit ramp for the men who actually provide that authenticity. Proof was caught in a lethal, high-stakes paradox. He was a multi-platinum artist with global recognition, yet he felt a cultural and moral obligation to remain in the very neighborhood that defined his art. From an investigative standpoint, the industry didn't just market Proof's environment, they enforced it. To the label, Proof's value was tied to his proximity to the streets. If he moved to a gated community in Beverly Hills, the brand of D12 and the gritty aura surrounding Eminem would lose its edge. He was incentivized to stay in the line of fire to keep the records selling. In Hollywood's eyes, his danger was an asset to be sold. In reality, it was a ticking time bomb. On the 11th of April, 2006, the paradox finally collapsed at the CCC Club, a small, dimly lit spot on 8 Mile Road. The investigative timeline of that night is a senseless sequence of escalating ego, petty disputes, and the toxic influence of the environment. What began as a simple disagreement over a game of pool quickly spiraled into a flash of steel and the deafening roar of gunfire. According to witness reports and police files, Proof fired a warning shot to de-escalate a fight, but in the chaos of the Detroit night, the streets don't recognize warnings, they only recognize casualties. When the smoke cleared, Proof the builder, the mentor, the man who had survived the lean years of the 90 seconds lay bleeding on the floor of the very road that gave the movie its name. He was 32 years old. The real crime here isn't just the shooting, it's the culture of expectation. It is a system that demands a man like Proof stay real and accessible to the streets until those streets eventually claim him. The industry extracts the war stories of Detroit to create platinum records, but it does absolutely nothing to dismantle the cycles of violence that swallow its most talented architects. Proof wasn't just killed by a bullet. He was killed by the weight of a loyalty that the world demanded of him but refused to protect him from. For Eminem, the death of Proof was the final, brutal shattering of the 8 Mile mirror. If the movie was about the one shot to get out, Proof's reality was the one shot that ensured you stayed forever. The man who spent his life being the hype man for everyone else, the one who pushed D'Angelo, the one who supported Eminem, had no one to hype him away from the lethal gravity of the CCC Club that night. D'Angelo Wilson, Brittany Murphy, and Proof represent 3 different ways the dream of 8 Mile consumes its own. D'Angelo was a victim of the industry's silence. Brittany was a victim of the support system's failure. And Proof was a victim of the price of authenticity. The heartbeat of Detroit didn't just stop. It was silenced by the very reality that Hollywood turned into a blockbuster. Now, we must examine the aftermath, the survivor, who was left to carry the guilt of a masterpiece that cost his friends their lives. When the cameras stopped rolling on 8 Mile, the world moved on. The public took the music, the fashion, and the slogans, turning them into a global brand that sold the dream of the underdog. But for Marshall Mathers Eminem, the movie never truly ended. It became a haunting, psychological loop of what-ifs that would define the next decade of his life. In the investigative study of human trauma, the years following the film's massive success are a dark examination of survivors' guilt, the crushing, invisible weight of being the only one to reach the finish line, while your brothers in arms are left in the dirt behind you. Eminem didn't just lose co-stars or colleagues, he lost his anchors. He lost the people who knew Marshall, the boy from the trailer park, before the world knew Eminem, the rap god. In the world of extreme fame, those anchors are the only things that keep an artist tethered to their humanity. When they are gone, the artist is cast adrift in a vacuum where no one speaks the truth. The murder of Proof in 2006 was the moment the floor dropped out of Marshall's world. Proof wasn't just a friend, he was a human shield. He was the one who translated the streets for the superstar, the one who stood in the gap between the genius and the danger. When Proof was buried, Eminem didn't just mourn a brother, he lost his sense of safety and his connection to the real world. The investigative evidence of this period shows a man retreating into a lethal isolation that mirrored the very tragedies we've been discussing. He began to believe in a dark irony, that by lifting his friends up into his spotlight, he had inadvertently made them targets. This is where the trauma cycle of fame turns inward and becomes predatory. Following Proof's death, and as the industry began to grow silent and cold around D'Angelo Wilson, Eminem became a recluse in his own mansion. He spiraled into a heavy, life-threatening addiction to prescription pills, the exact same silent pharmaceutical predators that would eventually claim Brittany Murphy. The success that 8 Mile promised had turned into a gilded cage. Marshall was a multi-millionaire surrounded by ghosts, haunted by the fact that the same city that made him a legend had swallowed the man who helped him find his voice. The records of this guilt are scattered across his music from that dark era like breadcrumbs in a forest. In tracks like Difficult, Going Through Changes, and You're Never Over, you don't hear a confident superstar. You hear a man drowning in the agonizing question, what could I have done differently? He blamed himself for bringing his friends into a spotlight that was too hot for them to handle. He blamed himself for being the survivor. He felt that his fame was a magnet for the tragedies that struck those around him, a curse that rewarded him with gold while punishing those he loved with lead or silence. But the industry, the same cold corporate machine that discarded D'Angelo Wilson and ignored Brittany Murphy's cries for help, only cared about the next product. They didn't see a man in a profound, terminal mental health crisis. They saw a profitable, dark period that could be marketed as a dramatic comeback narrative. To the system, Marshall's grief was not a tragedy to be healed. It was just another layer of his brand, another authentic struggle to be sold to the masses. The survival of Eminem is a miracle of resilience, but it came at a staggering emotional cost. He had to watch the 8 Mile mirror shatter piece by piece, year after year. First Proof, then D'Angelo, then Brittany. Every time the world played Lose Yourself at a stadium or a gym, Marshall was reminded of the people who didn't get to lose themselves in the music, they lost themselves in the fallout of the fame. Eminem remains the last man standing on the 8 Mile line, a veteran of a war that most people think was just a movie. But standing alone is its own kind of tragedy. He is living proof that while fame can give you everything, it often demands the people you love as payment in full. He carries their legacies now, not out of choice, but out of a profound debt to the ghosts who stayed in the shadow so he could stand in the light. He is the survivor, and in the world of 8 Mile, that is the heaviest burden of all. To truly close the case file on the ghosts of 8 Mile, we have to look past the individual tragedies and perform a systemic autopsy on the industry itself. We have to identify the pathology of a business model that is designed to harvest human struggle for entertainment while offering zero protection for the human beings behind the art. When you analyze the evidence, the deaths of Angelo Wilson, Brittany Murphy, and Proof weren't just isolated incidents of bad luck. They were the predictable results of a three-pronged systemic failure. First, we must examine the pathology of disposable talent, embodied in the case of Angelo Wilson. Hollywood has a predatory obsession with authenticity. They search the foster homes and the housing projects for kids who have lived through real trauma, because that trauma translates to raw, electric performances on screen. But once the filming is over and the marketing campaign is finished, the industry's interest evaporates. Angelo was a victim of the industry's silence. The system extracted his lived experience to give 8 Mile its grit, but it provided no infrastructure for his mental health or professional longevity afterward. In the eyes of the machine, Angelo wasn't an artist to be developed. He was a raw material to be used up and discarded. When the phone stopped ringing, the silence wasn't just a lack of work, it was a message from the system that his life no longer had a market value. Second, we look at the failure of the corporate support system in the file of Brittany Murphy. Brittany wasn't killed by the streets, she was killed by the indifference of a culture that views vulnerability as a liability. In any other high-risk profession, there are safety nets, but in the fame factory, the show must go on at any cost. The industry saw Brittany's physical decline. They saw the toxic isolation imposed by her domestic situation. But as long as she was insurable for the next shoot, no one intervened. They prioritized the production schedule over the pulse of a human being. Brittany died because she lived in a system that punishes sickness with unemployment. She was a multi-million-dollar asset who was allowed to wither in plain sight because the people around her and the studios that profited from her were more concerned with the image of a star than the survival of a woman. Finally, we confront the commercialization of danger in the death of Proof. The industry marketed Proof's street credibility to sell millions of records, but they never offered him an exit ramp from the very environment they were profiting from. They wanted him to stay real, to stay connected to the concrete, because that connection gave their product its edge. They incentivized his danger for their bottom line. Proof was gunned down on the very road that gave the film its name, a victim of a reality that Hollywood had turned into a global brand. This is the ultimate indictment of the 8 Mile masterpiece. It sold the world a dream of escaping the gutter, but it was built on the backs of people who the system never intended to save. The machine is still running, still looking for the next authentic voice to grind into profit, but the ghosts of Angelo, Brittany, and Proof stand as a permanent record of the human cost. They didn't just fail to handle fame. They were workers in a lethal environment with zero safety protocols. Their deaths were the interest paid on a debt of fame that they never truly owed. The system didn't just watch them fall, it provided the stage for the collapse and then sold tickets to the aftermath. Art has a way of outliving the hands that created it. But when the dust of the industry settles, and the profit margins are long forgotten, what remains are the voices. The ghosts of 8 Mile are no longer just statistics in a Hollywood coroner's report. They have become the conscience of a generation. As we close this investigation, we have to look at what Angelo Wilson, Brittany Murphy, and Proof truly left behind. They didn't just leave a movie or a platinum record. They left a warning, a lesson, and a heartbeat that refuses to stay silent. They proved that even in a system designed to consume you, your essence can remain untouchable. Angelo Wilson, the boy who dreamed past the foster homes, remains the patron saint of the quiet struggle. Every time a young artist from a forgotten city stands in front of a mirror and refuses to give up, D'Angelo's spirit is there. He reminds us that your worth isn't defined by Hollywood's call sheet, but by the raw honesty you bring to your craft. His silence was the industry's failure, but his memory is our responsibility. Brittany Murphy, the radiant light that the world tried to dim, continues to shine through the cracks of the fame factory. She remains a reminder that beauty is fragile and that empathy must be our first response to success, not our last. She wasn't just a star that burned out. She was an angel who suffocated under the weight of a world that didn't know how to protect her. Her laughter still echoes in the films she left behind, a defiant sound against the darkness that tried to claim her. And proof. The heartbeat. The man who lived and died by a code of loyalty that most of the world can't even comprehend. He is the soul of Detroit, a permanent fixture in the city's concrete. He showed us that the greatest shot you can take in life isn't the one that gets you out, it's the one you take to bring everyone else up with you. He didn't just hype Eminem, he hyped an entire generation to believe that their stories mattered. 8 Mile was more than a film. It was a crossroads where the American dream met the American reality. And while the reality was often brutal, the dream lives on in the survival of their art. Marshall Mathers is still standing, carrying the weight of 3 legends in his rhymes. Every verse he spits is a payment on that unpaid debt, a way to ensure that the world never forgets the names of the people who stood in the trenches with him. Tonight, we don't end on a note of tragedy. We end on a note of defiance. The system didn't win. It took their bodies, but it couldn't take their impact. Detroit still beats to their rhythm. The warehouses may be empty, the factories may be silent, but in every smoky club and every kid's bedroom where a beat is being made, the ghosts of 8 Mile are there, whispering the only truth that matters. Keep spitting. Don't ever stop. This is 8 Mile, where the pain becomes power and the music becomes memory. Rest in power, D'Angelo. Rest in peace, Brittany. Rest in rhythm. Proof. Your shot wasn't missed. It's still echoing,